how to make Windows more private, how to make SMS RCS more private, KYC-free crypto, end-to-end encrypted Discord alternatives, XMPP potential, TSA pre-screening, self-hosting considerations, EXIF data, and iMazing to help lock down iOS devices. We have a big week for the Q&A. Very fortunate to have all these questions come in from our patrons and people who are making this podcast free to everybody else. So thank you all for supporting us. And if you want to ask a question, you can already join next week's Q&A down in the description. And without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about Windows privacy. Oddbyte asked a few questions here, and the first one that we're going to tackle is kind of like the highlight question is, we're going to shorten this quite a bit because it was fairly winded. Why does everyone hate on Windows? What exactly is the privacy gain from Linux at all? Because he argues you can disable all the Windows telemetry with privacy.sexy, that Linux has no antivirus tools, is less secure, and experiences gaming issues on certain games, notably those with anti-cheat. Definitely some good questions, right? We overall are in the camp that you can make a lot of good privacy and security improvements on any operating system. You don't need to pick one specific operating system in order to proceed on your journey, if that makes sense. But in regards to your specific question, the reason why people hate on Windows, and us as well a lot of times, is that the invasiveness of the telemetry and how integrated it is into the operating system is very extensive, much more so than other operating systems. So if you block certain telemetry, it might break core critical features on Windows and vice versa. So it's this really tricky middle ground, and all these tools like privacy.sexy are really awesome, and I really like them a lot, but it's a little bit DIY. Like, they're not the most evidence-based tools. It's not like there's research that shows here's how effective they are at removing telemetry. Microsoft is also very good at evolving their telemetry, so one update might completely change something. There's a lot of people online who report that important features get broken when they use tools like this. It's kind of a tricky situation on Windows. You have to really hack at it, and the final result might do exactly what you want it to do, and in that case, then great. But the cool thing with Linux is that you can kind of just install it out of the box, and there really is no telemetry. There's like a few distros who have opt-in telemetry when you're setting it up, and that's about it. So it's pretty much just a non-issue. And I think that the security debate, I think, can exist actually separate from this, if that makes sense. Like, I see these as completely different discussions. There's like security over here, there's telemetry over here, there's the overall usability in a third group, and it's important for each person to go ahead and ask how much each of those three things matters to them, and then kind of compare and contrast which operating system makes the most sense. So those are overall my pieces of advice. I haven't seen much reason to say that Linux lacking good antivirus tools is a reason to avoid Linux. And I have yet to see how the cited reasons for Linux being less secure has actually played out in the real world in non-targeted situations. So those are my thoughts, and I'll let Nate carry it over from there.
I'm cheating a little bit because we're recording this much later than usual due to the travel time conflicts. Oddbyte asked this question in the SR chat, and I've kind of been keeping a loose eye on it. I've been pretty busy the last couple of days. I'm cheating because I'm going in with a better understanding of his argument. So first of all, I do agree with Henry. I think one thing to consider is the default. We are big believers that in a perfect world, privacy should be by default. We shouldn't need tools like privacy.sexy, which, personal opinion, that name makes me really uncomfortable, and I don't like recommending it to people. Like, there's technically nothing wrong with it, and I consider myself a sex positive person, but I don't know. That just feels like I'm 12 years old and made my first domain, just being totally honest. But it is a great tool.
Well, Nate, is privacy not sexy to you?
Sexy isn't the word I would use. Actually, that's a really good point. Is I took another look at it yesterday after reading all of this back and forth, and I was like, let me revisit this thing. And it's not really very user-friendly in the sense that it doesn't really explain what these different tools do. It gives you tons and tons of options. And to their defense, there are little toggles at the top that say, like, you know, this is an easy mode that probably won't break anything. This is like a more moderate mode, and this is a really strict mode. But when you go through and you start granularly looking, like if you go through the strict mode, it says double check everything to make sure you're not going to break anything. And there's, I think, I could be wrong, literally over 100 options. There's so many options. And granted, that's probably because Microsoft is so leaky and garbage. But then it doesn't really explain what a lot of them do. And it kind of expects you to just know these things, which is great if you're techie. But if you're just a normal person, it's like, I don't know, like, I guess I'll go with the easy one because I don't want to break anything, but maybe I could get more value and I just don't know it. And I don't have time to go through all of those. And again, I don't even know what all those options do. I would argue it's not the most user-friendly tool out there. Neither is, Windows Spy Blocker, for the record. But
and maybe that's what you're getting at, is that in some ways it's more user-friendly to just recommend someone install Linux than it is to actually successfully pull off these tools and be successful in using them.
And I mean, that's part of it. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. I mean, some of the tools are more user-friendly than others for sure. People shouldn't have to jump through those hoops. That's the point I'm trying to get at. People should not have to use W10 privacy plus O&O shutup plus privacy.sexy plus Windows spy blocker. They shouldn't have to use all this stuff to make their operating system not spy on literally every single thing they do. There's also, and I'm surprised nobody brought this up in the chat at all, there's also just the continual enshittification of Windows. There's the fact of like constantly pumping in ads, constantly pumping in Copilot, and now recall and all this garbage that nobody asked for. Like you said, it's so heavily integrated to the operating system, you can't opt out of it. And I also want to make the opposite argument real quick is, from what I understand, I'm not a developer, you can get a comparable level of security by using something like FlatSeal or AppArmor. Your argument goes both ways. And it's the same thing. Like Henry said, I don't really think for most people, antivirus is really that big of a deal nowadays. As long as you're keeping your stuff updated, don't randomly click on every link you see on the internet. Don't download every single file you find. Like just some basic hygiene. And I hate to say common sense, but like some basic digital common sense. And then the last thing I want to address is you mentioned like gaming issues. You know, apparently you're a gamer, I've gathered from the context of this conversation. This is why we always say there are situations and threat models. Like I still have a Windows computer. I'm using it right now because my Cubes computer simply cannot handle this recording, video editing, gaming. It can't handle that kind of stuff. And some of the games I play, I'm sure would work just fine on Linux. Some of them probably would not. There are situations where you say, if my threat model fits, I'm going to, you know, you could dual boot or you could have a separate device. You could be in these situations where you say, I'm going to keep Windows for the gaming side of things and do everything else on Linux, or I'm going to do sensitive stuff on Linux, or, you know, whatever. You don't have to go all in. And again, we do constantly harp on threat models and what works for you. But I think this may be mischaracterizing your argument. I think to say like everybody should just use Windows because you can do the same thing, I think that's a disingenuous argument because there's plenty of great reasons to not use Windows or to use Linux specifically or to use Mac. Likewise, what you did actually say is, why does everyone hate on Windows? I think it's well-deserved. Microsoft's security is garbage. Microsoft's constant enshittification of the OS is garbage. And Microsoft, for a company of their size, could choose to do better. I think that's all I got.
One little thing, I was just taking a look at it while you were talking. It's a cool tool, right? So if this works for you, like this is something that I think I even used privacy.sexy in the past for one VM I set up, and it works. I think something to just caution people on, this is not a just figure it out once tool. You shouldn't look at these tools this way because you're going to see, you know, these tools are also updated. Like Nate said, Microsoft releases new features, and then those new features end up in tools like privacy.sexy. And then you have to go online maybe 6 months later and run this tool again. And so it's this ongoing maintenance you also have to do with these tools as well, which you don't really have to do with Linux. Like you just don't have to really care about this stuff on Linux. You can kind of just get going.
One last thing to add that I forgot to mention, when I talked about how these tools aren't always user-friendly, the first time I tried out privacy.sexy, I did screw it up. I didn't like blue screen my computer or anything, but I did break something that I ended up having to go in and figure out how to roll back the script. And that's coming from somebody who's like relatively tech savvy. When you're talking about that level of tech sophistication, it's not fair to put it on the user. We can't expect everybody to have that level of tech literacy. I do believe everybody should have a basic level of tech literacy. I wrote a whole blog post about this, but there's different levels. We don't expect everybody to like read Tolstoy and Shakespeare in their free time. It's not fair to expect everybody to know how to code and how to understand scripts and stuff like this. Actually, this has been on my mind a lot lately. I'm just going to throw this last thought in. If we all agree that privacy is a human right, you're not supposed to gatekeep human rights. Nobody walks into a grocery store and somebody goes, oh, well, why should I sell you this bread? I mean, granted, there's money. That's a whole different argument I'm not going to get into here. But like, nobody goes in and be like, well, I don't think you're ready for this, like, high-end bread. Go get the cheap stuff. Like you don't deserve the whole wheat stuff because you don't know how the process is done and you didn't grow your own grain. But that's basically what we're doing with privacy when we're like, well, you should learn how to code so that you can fork this thing and make it work for you. Like, no, privacy should be freely available to everyone. Circling back to the beginning of Odd Bytes questions, we have, how do you make SMS or RCS more private? As far as I'm aware, Google owns all of RCS, and there are no alternatives that quote-unquote just work on any RCS-compatible devices. First of all, SMS, I'm going to focus on just the privacy here. I don't think you can make SMS more private. It's pretty much wide open. It's almost like sending a postcard, really. RCS is expanding to Apple devices, but I still think that, as far as I'm aware, using RCS on anything other than Google Messenger will not give you the end-to-end encryption. So you'll still get all the nice little fun features, like bigger attachment sizes and reactions and stuff like that, but you can't get the encryption. I think really you can't make it more private, because this is kind of one of those situations where a lot of people will argue, well, there's no point in using an encrypted email provider because most of the people you're emailing aren't using an encrypted provider, so your messages are still exposed and it gives people a false sense of security. I disagree with that take, but it is worth noting that they're not wrong. If I'm emailing somebody on Gmail, it doesn't matter if I've used Proton or Tuda, it's still gonna, be unencrypted on Google servers. And it's the same thing here. Even if there was theoretically some kind of open source RCS compatible client that you could put on your phone, it's still going to be sending messages to somebody else who's probably using either Google or Apple. And more importantly, the telecommunications are still probably going to keep a record of that. I could be wrong. I don't know how RCS plays into the SMS ecosystem and how telecoms treat that. But I know that regular SMS messages, at very least, they're keeping the metadata. I think your best alternative is to try to get people over to actual encrypted messengers like Signal or Session or SimpleX, things that are not treated the same way as these protocols and therefore are not leaving as big of a footprint. I don't think there's really any way around that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think there used to be, I don't know if it was a Signal fork or it like used the Signal protocol. There used to be this app that you could install that essentially tried to do end-to-end encryptions via SMS. It used weird workarounds to do it, and it hasn't been updated in years, even the one I'm talking about. So there's little workarounds for you to like send an encrypted message that's decrypted on the user's device locally. It's not going to address the metadata concerns and stuff like that SMS is going to have. I'm a bit bullish on RCS because the new RCS spec 3.0 includes end-to-end encryption. So I guess to clarify some things, Oddbite, you say Google owns RCS. It's actually a public spec from the GSMA. It's a universal thing that people can hook into. It's supposed to be interoperable, so Google doesn't own it. Google just kind of had the only implementation of RCS with end-to-end encryption, with its own end-to-end encryption for only Google Messages, and it used the Signal protocol for this. Apple did commit to use these new specs and to end-to-end encryption in some upcoming software update in like March of this year. So I am bullish that actually there will be end-to-end encrypted RCS between iOS and Android. Hopefully this year, maybe next year. We don't know what that means, but that's all I have to say about it. Otherwise, yeah, like Nate said, use a dedicated messenger, which will probably have better security and privacy anyway.
Quick clarification, because I didn't understand you for a second there. They committed in March to adding encryption in the future. The way you worded it, it sounded like it rolled out in March. That's not the case. Yeah, we don't know when it's coming.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, you're good. It could also just be me. I'm still half asleep. But like when you said that, I was like, oh, did it already roll out? And then my brain clicked. I'm like, oh, that's not what he meant.
Okay, next question from Oddbite. Other than P2P services, how does one get their hands on Bitcoin, Monero, and other crypto without an ID? They're aware of Bitcoin ATMs, but are there any other alternatives? This is kind of an always ongoing thing. If I'm going to send you to a resource to answer this better than I will, it's KYC, not me. Let me make sure I get that.
Yeah, KYC, not .me, I think.
Yeah, KYC not.me. Yeah, exactly. Just like Nate said. And it's a good site. It will tell you like what has KYC, what doesn't, if it's an exchange, etc. Also, it's kind of a marketplace as well. It'll tell you like what services support different things without KYC. So like IVPN, Mulvad, and all those services are there as well. Anyway, outside of that, you can always mine. So that's always an option. And nowadays with the electricity rates, you can't see it as a profitable thing perhaps, but you can at least see it as a way to actually almost convert fiat to crypto via electricity, I suppose. Other than that, I do recommend local meetups and events. See if there's a local cryptocurrency event. And also the last thing I recommend, this is actually what I do. It's fairly easy. Like it's not super hard to get KYC-free Bitcoin in like low amounts. And so if you're able to do that, then you can just swap it into Monero using like any swap service, or if you use Cake Wallet, you can just do it directly in Cake Wallet or any other wallet that allows you to exchange. Like those are kind of the main go-to strategies right now. So
I think one important thing to ask is you did mention crypto in general. You didn't single out Monero, because usually with Monero specifically, something we point out is Monero is designed from the ground up with privacy. So with something like Monero, we did cover the Coinbase data breach, and obviously there are concerns with giving these companies your ID. But putting that threat model aside for a moment, with something like Monero, once you start using it, it's kind of automatically not linked to you anymore. So it's kind of, as far as the privacy of the crypto itself, that doesn't really matter. So that's a good question, is like, what are you trying to do with it? If your goal is to get Monero, then yeah, you could just buy Bitcoin, convert it to Monero, and go. As far as I know, Most Bitcoin mixers have not been made illegal yet, so that's also an option. They're a little bit of work, but that's an option out there. Just worth asking if that's a feasible option. And Oddbyte's last question says, Signal, while amazing, is awful for groups and anything other than SMS chat or Snapchat replacement. No support for bots, no moderation tools, and max size is 1,000 members. Are there any other viable end-to-end alternatives to something like Discord? The short answer is no. The follow-up question is, why do you want something end-to-end encrypted that has more than 1,000 people in it? I think I cut it, but last time I'm pretty sure it was in the last Q&A, Henry and I were talking about how when we were on Matrix, people would always come into the room and they'd be so mad that they're like, oh, this room isn't encrypted. It should be encrypted. And it's like, why? It's an open room that anyone can join. So if you're talking about adding over 1,000 people, what is the point of encryption? Because at that point, you don't know who everybody is. And there's no way to guarantee that nobody's coming in and there's never a way to guarantee that. But especially when you're adding in untrusted people, you have no way to guarantee that those people aren't doing something malicious like scraping the group or taking screenshots.
A response to the actual question here of viable end-to-end encrypted alternatives to something like Discord, these are not at all like Discord. So I wouldn't say they're Discord alternative, but actually of all the, I'm looking at all the messengers that are end-to-end encrypted, SimpleX is the only one trying to do Telegram-like groups, but with end-to-end encryption, I believe. That's kind of it. Signal isn't really building in actual moderation tools, and SimpleX is at least trying to do some of those things. So that's kind of it. And I don't even think the SimpleX team would call it a Discord alternative. So but it's the closest I can think of.
Yeah, and SimpleX is also trying to add bot support. I don't think they're making any bots, but they did explicitly tell us that they're trying to make it more bot friendly for future uses. But even then, I think that's more depending on what kind of bot. They're looking more for business, autoresponders and stuff. They're not really looking for moderation bots or bots that pull the crypto prices or whatever kind of Discord bot you're thinking of. And also when I think of Discord, what I think of is something like Slack or Discord, where you have one community that has multiple rooms. So this is the on topic room, this is the off topic room, this is the meme room, this is the venting room, things like that. So yeah, if you look at it from that perspective, there's really almost nothing other than Matrix, because Signal doesn't have that. SimpleX doesn't have that, unless you're going to go make 50 rooms and then put in parentheses this is my group or whatever. There's really not a lot of ways to replicate that in my experience.
The next series of questions come from David Johnson, and the first one is, how, if at all, do you use XMPP? Which uses of XMPP do you think are robust and reliable at the present moment? Yeah, you kind of say which of these uses are for aspirational tinkerer proof of concept stages. XMPP is older than so many of the other tools that we use. So I think it's actually in its most polished state as it's ever going to be at the moment. I don't use XMPP for anything. I don't know what the use case of XMPP is for most situations. I know some people like that it's a little bit faster and more lightweight than Matrix, for example. And that's kind of the main selling point I've heard. It doesn't have default end-to-end encryption, and even the end-to-end encryption it does use, I know has been accused of being less secure of something like Signal. And if you appreciate the federation aspect of it, Matrix does that as well. So it's this situation where I can't find many use cases for XMPP, and it's not something I use, but I appreciate some aspects of it, of course. And that doesn't mean I hate it or anything like that. So that's all I have to say about it, really.
I know I keep saying this. I want to switch over to JMP chat. Other than that, I do not use XMPP at all. And you're kind of asking a question that's above my head. You say it could potentially support a huge range of applications, and you did specifically mention JMP chat's one of them. And what do we think are the robust and reliable uses at the moment? I don't know, because I don't know what it's being used for. I don't know what it's capable of doing. I don't know what I would like to see it do, and I don't know what projects currently exist that are using it. Next question from David Johnson. What are your thoughts on the privacy pros and cons of TSA prescreen/global entry? There are no pros. I'm just going to be point blank. I don't see any world in which there's a privacy pro of using TSA prescreen, because correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't done it. I think I looked into it for 5 minutes. From what I understand, it's basically you submit to a background check and then you can go through security faster. And you mentioned that. You say it's a convenience for frequent travelers. And it is. If I was traveling constantly, more than 50% of the time by plane, I would probably consider this. Thankfully, most of my experiences with the TSA have been neutral at best, or neutral at worst. There's pros on the convenience front. There may be pros on maybe they treat you a little better. I don't know, but I don't think there's any advantages to this on the privacy front.
Yeah, it really is a convenience thing if you're really trying to grab at straws. I mean, one pro I can think of is if you're going through TSA Pre and global entry, I think you're probably a lot less likely to deal with like in the moment situations,
Like
if
getting
that
your
makes
bag
sense.
searched or something?
Yeah, like, the security is a little bit more lax in those situations. And so you're a lot less likely, I think, to get an officer who's going to give you a hard time and you end up in a situation where your devices are searched or something like that. I guess there could be some peace of mind, but that's still not a guarantee. And it's a very hypothetical pro. And I guess the con is I believe the background check for these also requires a fingerprint scan as well. So that's just one more thing you have to think about. Realistically, none of this information is information the government already doesn't have about you, most likely. But it's more of just like you're not getting any gain from it either from a privacy perspective. So it really is a convenience thing. And for those who don't know, global entry will allow you to, like, I think, bypass or go through like a faster line for customs when you re-enter the US. And it comes with TSA Pre. Another question from David Johnson on self-hosting. It's frequently encouraged in the privacy community as a sort of quantum leap in improving your personal privacy. However, obviously some things are far better candidates for this than others. Which services would you almost certainly self-host? Which ones did you emphatically not try to self-host under any circumstances? And for which do you feel that it depends on how well you know the underlying technology, how much time are you willing to dedicate to it, and how critical uptime and timely patching is, etc. Yeah, so I'm going to be honest, the list I have of things that everybody should self-host is actually very slim. And even those, there are no guaranteed yeses, because I like self-hosting and I think it's good for the right person, but I'm also not like bullish on self-hosting. And I'm not the kind of person who's like, yeah, you're going to be so private when you start self-hosting everything, because there's a lot more considerations to it than meets the eye. To briefly answer your question, I think things that are offline, that are not public facing, that don't go on the internet, that are just things that you access on your home network are kind of the no-brainers as like the safest things to do. Things that you just have to access in your network. You never have to open up ports on your router. You never have to set up a VPN to access it remotely. Whatever your method is to access this data yourself. I really like those services, and that can be something as simple as like file transfer at home. You can have your own like AirDrop locally on your own network at home. Other than that, it's really a case-by-case basis, and people have to realize that self-hosting opens up a lot of risks that you don't have to deal with when you're using dedicated services. And I always like to ask, like, are you ready for the commitment of actually self-hosting something? Are you ready for the uptime and having to keep it online, especially if other people are dependent on it? Are you ready for that commitment? Are you ready to have to do patching? Are you ready to have to keep up with the newest threats and make sure that everything's properly secured? Like, those are the questions you need to ask when you're self-hosting software. And it's very possible that a lot of people who do self-host software are actually doing it less securely than they would if they were going through a provider that has like a full-time dedicated security team that's actually, their full job is to make sure that your data stays safe. Where self-hosting is great is for owning your own data. And you can still emulate that with other services with like zero knowledge encryption and stuff like that, assuming you're keeping consistent backups. But that is the benefit to self-hosting in my view. It's like your own program. No one can take it away from you. And also you're hosting your own data. So there's the digital sovereignty aspect of self-hosting. And I personally see that as like the main benefit. I don't even see it as inherently a privacy benefit, because there's certain services I can opt to use, like Signal, that are actually more private than some of the self-hosted messenger providers that I can set up myself, if that makes sense. So those are my thoughts on self-hosting. And I know it sounded very critical, but it doesn't mean I don't see value, and I do self-host like my own NAS and stuff like that, and I have a few services I use behind the scenes, but I am still overall critical, and I think it's a little overrated for the privacy community in my view.
Other than the overrated part, I do agree. I think not really an answer, but you said, what would you say like everyone should definitely do? It's not really self-hosting, but I agree with what Henry said about backups. The example that came to my mind was like Bitwarden. I don't think Bitwarden is going to suddenly disappear overnight or anything like that. So it's certainly a well-reputed service. But we've seen a lot in the last few years where, I mean, just a couple weeks ago, as we're recording this, Google pushes out an update, crashes a third of the internet. We've seen that happen a lot. And so things like Bitwarden, where if I can't access the service, can I still get my passwords if we're having an outage? And making sure that your stuff is synchronized, is up to date, you have backups, especially for people who are not using something like Bitwarden, who are using something like KeePass. I think that's great. More power to you. But now you have to do that additional management of, is your vault the same across all devices? That's not really self-hosting, but that would be the big thing for me, is any service you're going to use that is cloud-based, or anything you're going to use, keep backups. That's a big thing. I don't think it's talked about enough, to be honest. Which ones would I emphatically not try to self-host under any circumstance? Email jumps straight to the top of the list. I know we've talked about that in the past. And then which one do you feel like it depends? Honestly, all of them. Because even, let's take, okay, Jellyfin. I use Jellyfin. I love Jellyfin. And Jellyfin is literally one script to install. It literally does not get any easier than Jellyfin. However, now you have to have the hardware that can process a freaking video and broadcast that out to the internet. Even if it's just in your home, whatever, you still got to have that decent hardware. You've got to understand how to install Linux, which is not hard. Ideally, you should understand how to use the command line, at least a little bit, because when you're running a server, ideally you should install headless Linux so that there's less resources being used for a desktop that nobody's using. You have to understand automatic updates, or you have to remember to update. You have to have backups. And then you have to understand how to open an FTP server, how to upload the videos, how to maintain them. So even that comes with a certain amount of time you have to be dedicated to patching it and keeping it updated, and then understanding how to maintain it. It's not hard. It's the easiest service I've ever had. And so if you're on the fence and you're thinking about it, if you know how to install Linux and you have the proper hardware, absolutely recommend it. But it is worth noting that there's still some commitment involved in that. And then that scales when you're looking at things like Nextcloud. Installing Nextcloud, even when everything goes right, is like, I think it was an all-day thing. No matter how easy it is, there's still a bit of skill and time involved. So I think a lot of them really go on, it depends. How much do you really want Nextcloud? How much do you really want your own DNS provider? Like, how much work are you willing to put into it? I think that's really what it is. I think self-hosting is a lot easier than people think it is, especially if you're at the point, if you were able to install Linux by yourself and you understand basic networking, or you know where to get that information. And keep in mind, you can hybridize these things. So not to go on too long, but let's say you spin up your own Nextcloud server. It's not like, okay, I spun it up, now I have to move everything there. You can leave it running for a few weeks, see if it crashes. You can start with like low impact things. You can make a copy of all your memes and put them on Nextcloud and see what happens.
Yeah, I think the nuance here for me, as you're talking about this, because I don't disagree, a lot of these things are actually really easy to spin up. And a lot of services I've used are one-click install. Here's the nuance and here's the issue I have with self-hosting. It's almost misleading how easy it is to set up versus how much work actually goes into maintaining it properly, if you know what I'm saying. Like, that is the issue. Like, someone can be misled into thinking, oh, I installed this and I'm done and that's it. Wow. But then there's no further instructions on like, well, how do I keep this secure? How do I make this publicly facing in a safe way? If I'm actually sharing this with someone else and they're creating an account, how do I protect their data effectively? Like, these are the questions that aren't asked when you set things up, because you're kind of in the wild west of self-hosting. And if you don't know how to answer those questions, I would make sure to keep everything just local to yourself on your own Wi-Fi network. So it's kind of your own little safe space. I think that's the nuance here for me.
And then David Johnson's last question, you say, in terms of promoting privacy among skeptics, what do you think about responding to the statements of I have nothing to hide with a question such as how easy are you willing to make it for criminals to pretend to be you when they commit crimes, in the sense that it invites the other person to ask that of themselves and they will own whatever conclusion they come up with instead of having to submit to the opinion that came from you? That's a good question. First of all, I'm going to be honest with you. I've kind of given up on convincing people. If people come up to me in good faith, and I've had people do this at work. Like, I've literally had coworkers who will come up to me and they're like, hey, I've heard you're really into privacy. Genuinely curious, like, why are you into privacy? Why should I care? What's your argument? But if people are coming up, and I've had people do this, like, I've literally had people come into my inbox as the new oil and go, I feel this way, convince me I shouldn't. And I've straight up emailed them back and be like, I'm not going to bother, because you've made up your mind and I'm not here to convince you. You obviously know the arguments. Either you care or you don't. Like, you do your own threat modeling, you decide. Here's the thing, and this kind of ties into the second part. This made me say this is a really good question. Everybody's threat model is different. And this is something that I'm really trying to drill home lately, because we see this all the time, especially in forums. You see people say like, well, how do I make my parents care about privacy? I don't know. They're your parents, dude. Everybody's parents are different and everybody has different concerns. There is really no like one size fits all argument. But the thing I like about this argument is you point out like, they have to own whatever conclusion they come up with. I think that's really it at the end of the day. You know, that movie Inception, they talk about the idea that when you're planting an idea in someone's head, you have to make them think it's theirs. Otherwise, it won't stick. And I think that's a really big part of anything. Anytime I don't want to use the word debate because it feels loaded. Anytime you discuss something with anybody and you're trying to get them to change their mind, first of all, you're probably coming at it wrong. Second, you have to make them think that it was their conclusion. And I don't mean that in like a manipulative way, but like if you come in and you're like, I'm going to change this person's mind and convince them that privacy matters, all you're going to do is beat them over the head, make them feel defensive, and they're going to draw further back into their shells. It's the same way you would deal with like a cult member. You can't tell them they're in a cult because now they're defensive, their guard is up, they're not going to listen to anything you say. But if you can get them to like, this is the Socratic method, right? Where like you kind of make them ask the questions of themselves. Well, okay, if privacy doesn't matter, then why do you use passwords? Why do you close the door when you use the bathroom? Like if privacy doesn't matter, why aren't you willing to give me your bank account numbers? Like why you're not acting consistently? And I'm really oversimplifying here because that's still not a great way to do it. But yeah, when you lead them to a point where they come up with the idea and they realize like, oh, maybe it's not as black and white as privacy doesn't exist, or maybe it's not as black and white as I don't care about, maybe I do care about my privacy in some ways. That's what leads them down that road of changing their minds, I think.
I've been taking the approach. I think last time I was asked this question, I said the same thing. I feel like we might have had to answer this like a year ago. It's like, well, it's really easy to say that in your position, but someone like a journalist needs privacy. People who are activists, who are fighting for human rights, need privacy. Like, it's really good for me to refer to the examples where no one would argue with you that privacy is important, and then tie it back to them and say, so just because you don't see the value doesn't mean it's not an important thing. So it's like, you're missing out on this. And hopefully it just makes them at least see the importance of privacy as a whole. I think once you have that established, because I think a lot of people aren't even there yet. They don't even see how privacy is beneficial in any context. But then when you actually start making them realize, oh no, that makes sense. And then you go, well, but here's also how this impacts you. And here's why this is relevant to you as well. That's kind of the method I've been using lately. And it's been pretty effective. I don't know how much it sticks, but it seems to like very quickly people go, okay, that makes sense. I get it. That's better than success I've had in the past. So that's been my strategy.
It's a little bit played out, but there's that whole trope online of like when you argue something, you go straight to talking about like Hitler and Nazis. And one of the reasons we do that is because it's kind of like what you're saying. Like we need to start from an agreement on something. So like if we're saying something is bad and I'm like, okay, so if a Nazi did XYZ and people are like, oh my God, really? You're going to go there? Well, we can all agree Nazis are bad, right? So let's start from there. We don't have to debate like, well, is this person really bad? No, we're talking about the issue. If a Nazi did this, and it's kind of the same thing with that. Like, okay, if a journalist needs privacy, like we can all agree. That's why we go to these extreme examples, is to kind of get everybody on the same page. And sometimes it is a disingenuous argument for sure. But
we got A11 Personal who asks, how would I virtualize everything on different operating systems? Like I would love a virtualized Mulvad browser just launched through a shortcut through my start menu for search and taskbar. Yeah, the closest thing to what you're describing that's like super nice to use is unfortunately only really on Mac OS, and it's called Parallels. Parallels would allow you to install like a Linux virtual machine and install Mulvad within Linux. And it would literally open like on your dock on Mac OS as its own program. But it's actually a Linux program, if that makes sense. But it acts and behaves as if it's part of your Mac OS system. It's extremely seamless. It's extremely well done. It's by far the best virtualization software out there. But you can somewhat emulate this. I know there's like Sandboxy, I think. There are Windows Sandbox programs that can somewhat do this in a way, but it's going to most times be like on a native operating system. You can kind of do this, but not with individual programs, I think, with like Windows WSL, like the Windows subsystem Linux.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of actually, because I've started digging into it a little bit. WSL is terminal-based, command line-based, but I know they're starting to dip their toes into more like graphical programs and graphic interfaces. So you wouldn't be able to shortcut it, but you could maybe spin up WSL and then from there maybe launch something depending on what it is and if it supports a GUI yet. So
yeah, on that note, you can kind of recreate it. Like you can do multiple Linux subsystems on Linux, and maybe one like doesn't have a login and it opens Mulvad browser by default, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah, there are workarounds, and I'm sure there's a good one on Linux, but I'm not super familiar with this world on Linux. I've never had to, like normally I'm virtualizing Linux, typically. If I'm not on a Linux operating system, when I'm on a Linux operating system, I don't really need to virtualize anything. So I'm not actually that familiar, funny enough, on Linux for this side of things. But that's all I got.
We have another technical question from Esquilax. If a mobile app has permission to use the camera but not to read your location, do you know if your location could still leak via EXIF data if you take a picture with the app? Would the user have any control over this other than revoking the camera permission? I've seen settings to include or exclude EXIF data from photos, but I think these are settings for the app and not the OS overall. Well, first of all, I would say play around with it and find out. Definitely go out, turn off the location data, take some pictures, load it into your computer and check the EXIF data, or even on your phone. I know there's a lot of EXIF readers. So I had a realization here. You're talking about in-app. Like, for example, if you use Mastodon and you take a picture straight in the app, I don't know if that's a feature, I use it in the web, but you take a picture straight in the app. If you disable permission, then obviously you're disabling permission for all of Mastodon, not just that camera. In that case, yeah, I think your best bet is going to be to take the picture separately, wipe the metadata, and then upload it. That's always what I do. A quick and easy way to do that would be to take the picture with Signal, because Signal automatically wipes metadata. So you could take the picture with Signal, download it from your note to self, and then upload it.
One thing, I feel like maybe I'm reading into this a little too much. I think it's good to understand what EXIF data is, because reading between the lines, it sounds like, maybe I'm wrong, it sounds like you might think all EXIF data is just this like really
invasive,
atrocious thing that's happening. And it's like, well, it's actually not. Like, almost all of it is like, oh, the aperture of your camera and the color settings and the date the photo was taken. It's
the
actually
orientation
all very
of the photo.
mundane. Yeah, it's not serious. The only thing in EXIF data that actually can be and is the main thing that people care about is just the location. So if you're disabling location permissions in your camera app, then it won't save it, which I can confirm. Like stock camera apps, when you start them up for the first time, a lot of you probably don't remember this, but it always asks you for a location. And so if you use the iOS camera app, it'll ask you, like, can we use your location? Same with a stock Android. And if you say yes or no, then it'll either write the data or it won't. One middle ground, which is actually what I currently do, because I actually like having some basic location information on my photos, is I set it to like the broad range radius, if you see what I'm saying. Like you can set precise location or non-precise location, and I set mine to just be non-precise. So that way I have a city attached to each photo I take. And then if I need the city wiped when I'm sending it, then I'll do what Nate said, which is I'll just send it through Signal, which wipes that metadata. When it comes to specific services like Mastodon, just do your research on those specific providers, because different providers do different things. Like even nowadays, a lot of these, like Instagram, Facebook, I do think they also wipe metadata. It's a more well-known issue nowadays to like not include location information on photos uploaded to the internet. But you have to, do your due diligence and do research into each provider, because there could be a random one that doesn't do that. And then that's that.
The other thing is to be mindful of the file names. Again, the secure camera, for example, when you take a picture, it'll label it like image 0456 or whatever, But with my Calyx stock camera, when I take a picture, it's the actual date and timestamp. So it'll say, what time is it right now? June 17th at 7:24 a.m. my time. Yes, I'm awake very early to record this for you guys.
And I skipped my midday nap.
Yeah, we are suffering. And I've noticed a lot of things like Discord. If I see a funny meme on Discord and I want to share it, I'll download it. And a lot of the time I'll notice it says like FBIMG 057 blah, 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 blah. So I know that came from Facebook. Signal is usually pretty good about, it'll still have the timestamp, but it'll replace for when you downloaded it from Signal. My point is like sometimes even when you share it, it retains that original file name. So be mindful of that when you share things too.
Anon1 asked about a Privacy Guides forum post, which essentially goes into like hardening techniques for iOS devices. I wanted to know your thoughts on hardening an iPhone with iMazing. Love the idea, but concerned about the risks of using it as it's not open source. This is not a thread I've seen before. Today, I briefly opened it right before to just have an idea of what it even is. First off, it's a good, very good breakdown of just general things to do on an iPhone. 90% of it is stuff you can do already. It's just enabling lockdown mode, using advanced data protection, unchecking iCloud data on the web when you have advanced data protection enabled, toggling USB accessories, which you don't even have to do when you enable lockdown mode. So all of it is just things that you just do natively inside of your iPhone, with the exception of creating an MDM profile. If you set this up, you have a little bit more granularity and a few extra settings to play with. So one, allow app installation false. So pretty extreme, allow host pairing false and force encrypted backup true. And you can already do encrypted backups without doing this. I bet this just kind of forces it so that even if someone was to somehow force a backup of your phone, they couldn't do it in an unencrypted format, is I'm guessing the benefit there. So those are kind of the three major things that you can do. That's kind of it. So I guess my point is, if you really want to maximize, you can, but all the other things should still be very effective and give you more than enough security for most threat models. Those are my thoughts. It seems like a cool little extra thing to play with, but I don't think it's necessary for most people.
Homie, you're using an iPhone. If open source is concerned, that ship has already set sail, hit an iceberg, and sunk. I say that lovingly, but like the short version is like iMazing, first of all, I've heard good things. I think it is a well-reputed, trustworthy tool. But like if your concern is the source availability, like I think that would be my bigger concern if open source is your concern, personally. Yeah, I didn't look at the forum post. As far as I know, it's a reputable tool. Like it's not super, super common, but I know I've seen it around. It's legit. It's not just some random script on GitHub or something like that. Like Henry said, you don't have to. I think one of the reasons on my website that I list a bunch of settings changes on stock phones is I think those will get you really far, depending on your threat model. Like if you're going for the maximum level of privacy, then yes, you're going to have to get a pixel. You're going to have to put a custom OS on it. But if you're just like an average person who's like, I just want less invasive advertising, I want less privacy invasions, I just want less creepy technology, I think there's a lot you can do with just changing some settings, swapping out some of the stock apps for, more privacy respecting alternatives. And so I wouldn't lose sleep over it, like Henry was saying. But yeah,
One last thing, I really want to be careful when I say this. No one needs iMazing, but it seems like a trustworthy and good tool. As Nate was talking, I was going through their security and privacy page, and it actually is a lot of good stuff. It's all locally stored. They seem to have a very good security and privacy background if you look at their language and the way they're talking about things. And it actually is probably even easier than iVerify to check for spyware. They have a spyware analyzer that checks for Pegasus, Predator, Kingspawn, and Operation Triangulation. You can do some cool stuff with iMazing as well.
I know it's a promoted video, but All Things Secure did a video where he talked about iMazing. He talked about his experience going through a border checkpoint in China, because he lived in China for like 11 years or 7 years or something like that. And he talks about a time he went through the border and they checked his phone. They like took it into the back room and gave it back. And so he talked about using iMazing and how he would have used that had he known about it at the time to verify if his phone was still safe to use, which I think there's an argument to be made there. If your threat model and your finances allow, like just chuck the phone and buy a new one, play it safe, because you can never prove that your phone is not infected. But the point is, he really goes into detail about iMazing and at least some of its capabilities, if you want to follow up on that some more.
That's going to wrap up all of our answers to the Windows privacy question, how to make SMS and RCS more private, KYC-free crypto, end-to-end encrypted Discord alternatives, XMPP potential, TSA pre-screening, self-hosting considerations, EXIF data, how to virtualize a little bit more seamlessly, and on iMazing. A huge week. That might be the longest Q&A of all time for us, perhaps. So definitely really appreciative for the questions and for our community. And we want to thank you all for leaving those questions. And we would love to have more of you ask next week as well. So if you want to join and also support the podcast, keep it free for all of you, check it out in the description on Patreon. You can also go to xmrchat.com/surveillancepod if you want to do it via Monero KYC free. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.